All right, it's 7:01, so we'll hop right into it. Welcome on in, everyone, to our webinar on using your PSAT score to plan for a spring SAT or ACT. So we're going to be speaking to both juniors and sophomores in this presentation. Juniors, of course, who would be planning to take their testing this spring. Sophomores who are probably looking to make a plan to test next year. Yet we want to kind of go through what you should be thinking about now in an effort to make that plan as effective as possible. So, the very first thing to mention here is that grades and academic rigor are typically considered the most important factor in college admissions. When I say grades and academic rigor, I really mean what it says on your high school transcript, so the grade you earned and the level of the course. One way to think about grades and test scores, I like to use an analogy to the NFL draft. Sorry if I lose anyone with this, but basically, in the NFL draft evaluation of players, you have a player's college game film, which is to say, how they performed over the long haul of their college career, day in and day out. And that's analogous to a student's high school transcript. That's a long record of how they performed day in and day out. And then you also have in the NFL draft process the combine, which is where they take specific athletic testing. How high can you jump? How fast can you run? How many times can you bench press? 225 pounds. And so the idea is colleges care about both of these things because they want to see how students do in the long run. But how students do in the long run isn't standardized. In football, you have different levels of competition depending on the, conference that you're playing in. And in schools, there's the grading systems of one school are not the same as the grading systems of another. Standardized testing is a way to kind of level the playing field and evaluate students in a more comparable way. Now, the other thing that's really important to mention here is that grade inflation is rampant in American high schools, and this is something that tends to surprise a lot of parents when we talk about it. But essentially, this graph shows that of college-bound American freshmen, about 84% of them report having had at least an A minus average in high school. So one thing that often comes up when we're talking with families about standardized testing planning is the conversation of, oh, my student's a good student, but a bad test taker. They get mostly A's and a handful of B's, but they're scoring, say, around like 1060 to 1090 on the SAT. And the truth is that, mostly A's and a couple of B's is a roughly average grade point average for students who are applying to college. And the score in the, 1000 range on the SAT is actually roughly around the nationwide average. So those, that score and grade profile actually do kind of line up when we look at the aggregate of all the numbers. And so I bring that up just because when we talk about grade inflation, um, it's important to kind of go into this college admissions process with both eyes open. So I have here data from the University of Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh is a fairly selective state school, but it's not one of the most selective schools in the country, which is why we use it as an example. And at the University of Pittsburgh, which uses a weighted GPA, 61% of their admitted freshmen had at least a 4.0 GPA. The average GPA of a Pitt student is over 4.0. And so I say this because, we're not talking again about one of the most selective schools in the country. This is what it looks like at a flagship state school, and not one of the most competitive flagship state schools, but a competitive flagship state school. So I just say this all to provide some context. Now, when we compare that grade inflation graph with average ACT scores over the past 30 or so years, we can see that, test scores are standardized year over year. And they tell you the same thing from one year to the next because they're normalized to a population. Now, when we zoom in on standardized test scores, the trend is actually a little bit more worrying than that in the sense that, since the pandemic especially, standardized test scores have been falling in this country. These tests test fundamental skills in reading, writing, and math. And we can see evidence that, during the COVID period when a lot of students were having to, do school virtually, teachers were adapting on the fly to a different way of doing things that wasn't the way that they were trained. Obviously students suffered in their learning as a result, and the standardized tests actually reflect that. So, standardized tests tell the truth and they tell the same thing year over year. Now, when I say standardized tests tell the truth, I don't mean that like you are your test score. I want to be very clear about that. Standardized testing is very accurate on a population level, meaning that the aggregate of test scores is correct. And it means that, generally speaking, standardized tests serve an important part in the college admissions process. I'm going to hand it over to Evan to kind of talk about how colleges use these scores and what they learn from them. So go ahead.
Yeah, so colleges love to use standardized test scores in one sense to compare students to the population as a whole, of course. They can also serve even more than a transcript of a student's courses to predict a student's success at college. It is Standardized test scores are actually the number one predictor of a student's success in their freshman year of college, more so than their actual grades in high school. Um, with different grading levels, different rubrics, and with the grade inflation, that should make sense. With this nationally standardized test, you're gonna see a lot more normalized. You're gonna get a lot more normalized sense of how students are doing going into college. Additionally, standardized testing is going to provide local context. Uh, there is a school profile attached to a student's transcript whenever they send their transcript to a college as part of their college application. That is going to include the high school's average SAT and ACT scores. So, with that school profile, that's going to compare the student to, how other students at their same school did on a test. So that makes it really easy to see for colleges to see when a student is particularly outstanding compared to their peers, not just at their school, but also in their area as well. And finally, in the test prep business, we like to think that standardized tests are the one, the only, the big thing, but they really are just part of a holistic review process that does include that grades and rigor, includes extracurriculars, includes essays. They they are part of the picture. They are an important part of the picture, but they are not the whole picture. But speaking of when they are used and required, I'm going to segue into my next slide here. There are three major policies that we'll see with colleges regarding submission of test scores. Those will be test optional, test required, and test blind. Test optional is somewhat self-explanatory. Most colleges nowadays are test optional. That means that when you submit your application to the college, you are not required to submit standardized test scores with that application. Test required means the opposite. You are required to submit a test score for your application to be properly considered and reviewed. University of Georgia, Florida State, Ivies, these all are test required. And then test blind means that schools will not consider test scores submitted with an application. So the UC system and the California state system will not consider test scores as part of their application.
Now, understanding these policies is kind of key to applying. Test required and test blind or score free are pretty straightforward. You just either must or must not send your test score, right? We know exactly what to do in those cases. Test optional is the kind of blurry middle ground, and test optional is really an umbrella term for a wide array of institutional philosophies on the proper use of standardized test scores in college admissions. What test optional really means is that the college will take your application fee and process your application, whether it includes a test score or not. You'll notice no mention of a likelihood of success in that policy. Generally speaking, for every college that has actually been transparent with their data on this point, which is sadly few of them, students who submit standardized test scores are admitted at a higher rate than students who do not. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind that generally speaking, even in a test optional world, your best chance of college admission is to apply with a score that that college considers strong. Now, what score does that college consider strong? It's going to vary quite a bit from one college to the next. With we have some colleges that are test optional, like for example, Duke or Auburn, where over 70% of the students are admitted with scores. So it's not very optional. Auburn, in fact, is over 90%. Then we have other test optional schools where they're admitting fewer than 30% of their students with test scores, like University of Washington and Pepperdine, for example. These colleges are kind of more genuinely test optional, where they believe they can do an equally good job either way. Most colleges are going to be between, 40 and 60%, right around 50% in many cases of students they're admitting with or without scores. And so, the troubling thing as a student in this process is that when you see on a college's website that test scores are optional, they don't tell you how optional they really mean, right? So this is something that you can find using something called the common data set. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested, but I don't want to get bogged down into a little detail like that. I want to stick to our main topic for the night. But just so you know, that's kind of the landscape of testing policies at the moment. Now, the bottom line for students is that a strong test score is still an admissions asset. Having that strong score is going to give you more options for colleges that will admit you, because you'll have, access to test required colleges and colleges that strongly prefer test scores, and also merit scholarships, because there are many colleges that require scores for merit scholarships. In fact, Pepperdine, who on the previous slide I described as very test optional, their best merit scholarship is actually test scores required. So even at a test optional school, there may be merit scholarships where you need a test score. Now, the generally speaking, when you are applying to highly selective schools, and we're choosing to define that in this example as any college with less than a 15% acceptance rate, the score is more important. And that's because there are so many strong applicants that having that one more point in your favor is generally going to help you more. Whereas if you're applying to a college that you're otherwise overqualified for or that admits 70% of students, it's less significant to, the decision as to whether or not to send the test score. But the last thing I want to say here is that, this time of year, we always talk with, a handful of families for whom obtaining that strong standardized test score would just require an undue amount of, time and energy in this process. And if that's the case, there are a lot of test optional options out there. So it's not like you must, apply to college with a standardized test score. That's not how it is anymore. Certainly not applying with a test score will limit your options, both in terms of probability of success and cutting you off from colleges that require the scores. But for some students, that sacrifice is, worth the time that they gain back from the kind of test prep process. This would be really an extreme case. I mean, we work with hundreds of families every year in terms of figuring out testing plans. And I would say, fewer than five, I'm typically recommending upfront, like, hey, let's not even try standardized testing. You should spend your time elsewhere. But there are students for whom that makes the most sense. So I do, recommend having an honest conversation about it if you think that might be you. Okay. Now we get into the fun part of the presentation, which is where we talk about the actual tests that you can take, the SAT and the ACT. So I'm going to start by talking about the digital SAT. It's very similar in format to the PSAT. In fact, it's pretty much exactly the same in format to the PSAT, but it's a slightly more difficult test. Essentially, you have four sections on the digital SAT. Two of those are going to be reading and writing, and two of them are going to be math. Each of those gives you a score out of 800, and then you get your overall score out of 1600. The SAT at one point was out of 2400. That was a bit of a blip on the historic radar. We're back to 1600. The biggest challenges on the SAT, and this is relative to its counterpart, the ACT, are that the SAT has limited annotation tools. And what I mean by that is the ACT you can still take on paper. And when you're talking about annotating a test to make your own life easier, there's nothing better than having a pencil and a piece of paper where you can write anything you want wherever you want. The SAT's application, it has ways to store notes and highlight, and you can use different colors. There are a lot of cool things you can do in that app, but the limited annotation tools make it a little bit challenging at times to use certain test taking strategies. The verbal questions on the SAT, generally students find them more challenging. You get more questions with a higher level of vocabulary, more complex sentence structure. You get poetry. You get, passages with the English from the 1800s. None of that is true about the ACT, which in its reading passages is really going to focus on like the latter half of the 20th century at the earliest. And on top of that, the sentence structure tends to be a little more straightforward on the ACT and the vocabulary level, not to quite as high a height. Final challenge of the SAT is the fact that the test is adaptive. So I'm going to explain what adaptive scoring is just very briefly. Uh, and this is how the PSAT worked as well, students, if you're curious. But every student gets a first module, and this is true for the reading and writing section and for the math section, of standard difficulty. Your performance in that first module dictates the difficulty level of your second module. There's a module 2A, which will be a little bit easier, and that means you didn't do as well in the first module. And there's a module 2B, which will be a little bit harder, and that means you did well in the first module. Now, your second module will dictate where on the kind of scoring curve you can spit out to. So, for example, if you're testing into the easier second module, your score may be, hypothetically capped. Now, this is something that can sometimes drive students crazy because they're agonizing over, oh, like how am I going to test into one module versus the other? I've had parents call me and say, hey, what's the strategy for like, with our goal score, could we maybe get some questions wrong in module one on purpose to test into the easier second module? And then maybe we have an easier time getting to our score by absolutely acing the easier one than mucking through the harder one. Um, and I just want to say emphatically for everyone here, never get a question wrong on purpose on the SAT. So it's a bit of a distinction without a difference, this idea of testing into the two modules and then your score's locked a certain way. Mainly because if you think about it, when the SAT's math section was, basically one section, if you got half of the questions wrong in the first half of it, guess what? Your score was capped, right? So this is not really a difference in the sense that, like, yeah, your performance on the first half of the test matters and your performance on the second half of the test matters. The scaling difficulty thing is different. We work with relatively few students who, by the time they take the test, might test into one module or the other. So typically, which second module you're going to get, and you can prepare for that. There is a bit of difficulty involved. Like, for instance, if you test into the harder second module, well, you get the same number of minutes and same number of questions in both modules. So then it's harder to finish the harder module on time because you have the same amount of time to do harder stuff, right? So that is something that can sometimes mess with students' heads, but with proper coaching, honestly, the fact that it's adaptive shouldn't really matter to your test taking strategy. It's just about trying to get the next question that you attempt correct. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Evan to talk about some of the changes we're seeing to the ACT this fall.
Yeah, so recently, as of September, the ACT has changed format. The content broadly is still the same as it has been for years and years. The format is a little bit different, though. First off, the test has become a little bit shorter in terms of the number of questions per section. There is more time per question now, bringing this closer to parity with the SAT. Historically, a big challenge to a lot of students with the ACT was that, simply put, the pacing was a bit grueling. There were a lot of questions and not a lot of time per question to complete them, each of them. So the pace has been alleviated a little bit, I'll say. Additionally, the ACT is really trying to expand their digital option. They are still primarily a paper-based test, and frankly, we really recommend that students stick with that paper-based version of the test. The digital option the implementation is basically it's a test under glass, we'll call it. So it's the exact same, it's presented in the exact same way as the paper test, but it's on a screen, so you have to scroll around, and the navigation is a little bit, it really is has not been perfectly adapted to a screen, essentially. So students are going to have a lot easier of a time taking it on paper, and additionally, they'll have access to the best annotation tool of all, which is a pencil put on their paper. And finally, the I would say one of the biggest changes in terms of the test is that the science section of the ACT has become optional at registration. Just like the writing section of the test has been optional for quite a while, the science section is now optional. This means it is no longer included in the composite score of the ACT. It is reported as a separate score. Many colleges still require the science section, however, that advice may change. Their policies may change in the future, but for now, many colleges still require the science section. So we really recommend that students continue to take the science section while these consensus has yet to be formed between schools. So here, what I've got is essentially just a comparison diagram between the legacy version of the ACT and what we'll call the enhanced version of the ACT. In the legacy version, you've got English, math, reading, and science, which are all the mandatory sections, and then the optional writing section, which is the essay portion. Now you've just got English, math, and reading, which are the mandatory portions, and both science and writing are optional. We recommend students take science again. We do not recommend students take writing as no schools require the writing section for college admissions. And we'll pass it back over to Jim now for how you might want to use your PSAT score in informing your test prep journey.
Okay, so we've done a lot of background on, how test scores fit into the picture of admissions, on SAT versus ACT. Now let's talk about your actual PSAT score and what you do with it. So the PSAT is an initial benchmark. That's the first thing I want to say. It is not your final score, and no college will actually see your PSAT. Often we find that there's a difference in perceived difficulty and the score a student gets on the PSAT. If that happened to you, there are a couple reasons that might be. One, you have no experience with an SAT-like test or very little if you've taken the PSAT in a previous year. So, of course, without a kind of firm anchor of how hard it's supposed to be, it's hard for your sense of the difficulty to be accurate. Two is that if you get that easier second module, that often means you didn't do as well in the first module. So if your test was actually easier, that might mean that your score is not going to be as high. And vice versa. If you thought the test was really difficult, that means you did test into that harder second module. So the best thing to do with your PSAT score is to use it as a point of comparison with an ACT diagnostic test. So the idea is that you want to pursue the test that's likely to give you better results because colleges view the SAT and ACT equally. There's no reason to kind of privilege one test or the other in your decision making. And for that reason, we recommend students essentially just try both tests, see which one they're better at, and focus on that test going forward because typically the one you start with a stronger score on, you would also end with a stronger score, after preparing for the test. So with ACT and SAT diagnostic testing, we offer free remote diagnostic testing to anyone. The idea is that you complete a practice test for the ACT at home. We send you the instructions for doing so. Then we grade that test for you. We offer a recommendation for SAT versus ACT. And then we offer a test prep planning call where we talk you through kind of based on your results, why we recommend one test or the other. We talk about potential test dates and what the tutoring process would look like if you're working with us. You can take this diagnostic anytime. But if we're talking about timing, then really juniors, I recommend you take a diagnostic ACT pretty much as soon as you can, because we want it to be a fair comparison with the PSAT. So we want you to take it kind of close in time to when you took the PSAT. And also, if you're aiming for one of the spring test dates, like for example, the March SAT, typically we recommend starting in December for that test date. So that would mean you'd want to have your diagnostic ACT score to confirm the SAT is the test for you before you would start the actual preparation in December. Sophomores, the goal for you should be to have diagnostic testing done by the end of the school year if you're planning to test earlier, and by your PSAT results junior year if you're planning to test later in the school year. So a lot of sophomores will plan to prep over the summer. Evan's going to talk a little more about that and why you choose kind of one timeline or the other in a moment. But just note that if you're planning that earlier timeline, you want to take your diagnostic testing before the end of winter break. If you're planning that later timeline, I'd recommend taking the diagnostic test next year when you have that updated junior year PSAT score. If we have any freshman families in the presentation today, I would say wait for sophomore year. There's no reason to do diagnostic testing freshman year. You've got a lot more learning and growing to do before you're ready to make this decision. Teenagers' brains grow very fast at times and slow at others. And that those fits and starts of human development are kind of unpredictable. So, you want to just wait until closer to when you're actually going to be doing all of this to start to really make this decision.
So, in terms of the timeline for testing itself, we really do not preach a one size fits all solution. Generally, we recommend a junior year testing timeline, a fall timeline for most students, but that comes with a lot of caveats. Fall timeline is good for students who want to spend the summer before their junior year doing a lot of test prep to get ready for their first test in the fall. Um, but that's also going to depend on them having completed Algebra 2 and geometry by their junior year, or the equivalent integrated math, which is going to depend on the specific school they go to. If you're not sure where your student falls in terms of that completion level, email us. We'll figure it out for you. A spring timeline can make sense for students who are busy with extracurriculars or other things going on in the summer when they would be preparing, or the fall when they would be testing. So, for instance, if a student knows that they're going to be going to summer camp in the summer, when you normally go to summer camp, um, that would sort of preclude preparing for a fall test, or at least one of the earlier fall tests. They might maybe fit something in later fall, but not generally as recommended. Another thing to consider is mental health. We really preach that students shouldn't try to cram all of their stress into as small a space as possible, like a pressure cooker. Not a great idea. So what we really want to do is spread that stress out to a lower level throughout the year, just so things are a little bit more manageable throughout the year.
Yeah, and specifically on that point, the end of junior year tends to be the most stressful time. And we can show you in our kind of tutoring results that we actually get our lowest homework compliance for test prep homework in the late spring of junior year. And that's because we're fighting against AP exams and finals, final papers, final projects,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
So we know that students are going to be academically taxed the most at the end of junior year. So the goal is to really try to get that, testing done before then if you can. That's why for the students who have completed Algebra 2 and geometry by the end of 10th grade, we really recommend aiming to prep over the summer and take the test in the fall, and or if you're not available over the summer, to start like right in the fall semester and try to get it done by winter break.
One thing that isn't really a factor when considering what the testing timeline is which test dates have the easiest or hardest difficulty curves. There is no evidence to suggest that any specific test date consistently has an easier or harder difficulty curve. The curves are predicted based on the difficulty of the individual test that's been written, not based on their actual test day performances. Basically, they are normed to the difficulty of the test, not to the performance of the students. There are easier and harder tests, but they just kind of occur randomly throughout the year. So there's no way to predict which tests are going to be easier or harder. And frankly, that the difficulty of the test should be accounted for in the curve of the scoring.
Right. And a lot of
Um,
the variation, honestly, in a hard or difficult test is individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
Some topics might show up between 2 and 4 times on the test. Well, if it's a topic you're less comfortable with and it's 4 times, that's going to be a harder test for you
Yep.
than a test that, has that same topic
Yeah.
twice.
A lot of kind of very variation at those high levels.
Yep. All right, so I have here the full menu of SAT and ACT test dates each school year, which month they're offered in at least. And I wanted to just take you all through kind of my thoughts on each of the test dates. So this is going to be a little bit freewheeling. If we're aiming to prep now, then we're really targeting a March SAT and then either the February or April ACT date, depending on when exactly you're getting started. April, if you're planning to start in the new year or around the winter break period. February, if you're planning to start like closer to right now. So the idea with these test dates is that you take the March SAT, then you can retest in May or June. That's going to be that more stressful time of junior year, but preparing for a retest is easier than preparing to take the test for the very first time. Typically, students are going to do fewer hours of prep heading into a retest than they do for the first test. For the ACT, you have June or July as your kind of spring test dates. July's nice because you get a full month after school lets out in June to prepare for it. And then coming around to the fall of senior year, what I have here is the deadline for testing for most early action and early decision deadlines for colleges is in yellow. So the October SAT is typically the final deadline for SAT for early action and early decision, and for the ACT, it's typically the September test date. And then you have until December of senior year for the regular deadlines. So you'll notice SAT has more options in the fall, but they also don't have that July test date that doesn't overlap with final exams, final papers, final projects, and AP exams. The May SAT date is the one that always kills our students because most of them are taking, APs or IBs, and often their exams and things are coming to a head then. Um, so I recommend basically just knowing this full slate of options that are available to you when you make your initial plan, because you want to go into it with all the information. Now, ideally, if we're starting now, for example, for the February ACT, we sure hope we don't need the September ACT, right? That is not going to be the plan. But we want to just know kind of like what's the full slate of options available for if you get sick the day of the test, or there's snow, or, a million different things can happen that could change a student's testing timeline. So just understanding kind of what the full timeline should look like for this, I think is helpful.
Well, you might say, well, if I want to maximize my number of chances of submitting an excellent score to colleges, why don't I take both the SAT and the ACT? Well, we're not going to stop you. You can take both tests if you like, but your return on the investment in your time spent preparing is going to be maximized if you're focusing that prep on one test rather than spreading it thinner across two. It could make sense to test both to take both SAT and ACT for specific students, specifically high scorers who it doesn't really matter which test they're taking if they're uh, in certain cases they may just need more chances to have their best scoring day on the right day, essentially. And, here's some links that we'll send this out after the presentation. Links to the SAT and ACT registration. You can enter your zip code to see the testing centers that are closest to you. If you check the box that says, yes, I would like to receive optional information from colleges, that just means College Board and the ACT are going to sell your name as part of marketing, your information as part of marketing lists, and you're going to get a bunch of emails from a bunch of different colleges advertising to you, essentially. You may want that, you may not. Just thought we'd let you know. However, you should not opt to have your scores sent to colleges automatically. You really want to have that ball in your court. You want to have control over what scores colleges see. So do not opt to have your scores sent automatically.
Now we have here just some quick tips for people whose students get accommodations for the test. If you're working through that process, we have a post on our blog that just kind of takes you through the basics of what you need to know for SAT and ACT accommodations. SAT is straightforward. If you had them for the PSAT, you're already set. ACT's process is a little more complicated, and I'd refer you to the blog for that. Excuse me. And then also you can book a call with me if you have any questions about it. And I'll have a call, about the accommodations process for any family who's even considering working with us. So you don't have to be like a current tutoring student to talk with me about it. I'm always happy to kind of walk you through and answer any questions that you have about that. We don't talk about it much in this presentation because it doesn't apply to many people, so we'll move along.
In terms of how you want to prepare for taking a standardized test, we recommend basically practicing how you play. Practice essentially in authentic test conditions, you're taking full timed practice tests just like you would if you were actually taking the SAT or the ACT. We recommend taking it in a semi-quiet environment, such as a library, similar level of noise to the testing room on test day, and take that test all at once, just like you would take the real thing, with that short 10-minute break between the middle two sections, just like you would get for the real thing, just so you can build up that stamina level and get that familiarity with the time component of the test. Also, don't prepare too much in areas where you're already doing well. Really try to focus your preparation on areas of personal need. Don't focus too much on math if you're in Calc AB, essentially. You want to focus more on the English area if that's where you're weaker. And additionally, be consistent. Don't take practice tests sporadically when you feel like it. Make a regular schedule to practice for the SAT and ACT weekly, if possible, is where we see the best results. Um,
Yeah, I like to say, there's an old saying that the best form of exercise is the one that you'll actually do.
exactly.
And so people often ask me with test prep, like, what's your opinion on self-preparation? And my opinion is it's when it happens, it's great,
Yeah.
But it's of course typically going to be students, last priority in the sense that like they have a quiz on Tuesday, they've got a paper due on Friday, they've got a million assignments in between, whereas the SATs in a few months. That's one of the benefits of, working with a test prep professional is you have a weekly appointment and an assignment for that appointment. You actually have a deadline.
Yeah, an accountability partner who's also a subject matter expert. What could be better?
Yeah.
In terms of when you're going to get scores back from those tests, scores for the SAT are released on the second Friday after the test, so a little under 2 weeks after you test. With the ACT, scores begin to be released the second Tuesday after the test, but it may take up to 6 weeks after that to receive them, especially if a student receives extended time. It may take longer for them to receive their scores. And one of the last things I'll talk about today is superscoring. Superscoring is a great tool for students to be able to put their best self forward on their college applications. Essentially, what superscoring is I'll give you an example. Let's say a student takes the September SAT and the October SAT. On September, they score 1300, 700 English, 600 math. In October, they also score 1300, but this time the scores are flipped. 600 English, 700 math. What they can do with super scoring is essentially take that 700 English from the first test and that 700 math from the second test and submit that as a 1400 to colleges. Uh, they never scored a 1300 on an individual test, but their overall super score is 1400. This can really reward retesting as when you are preparing for a second or even third test date, you only need to focus on the sections where you want to bring your score up. So if you got the perfect 800 in math on your first SAT, you probably don't need to look at math anymore when you're preparing for the second test and you want to bring that English score up. Not all schools super score. Notably, Penn State and Georgetown do not super score, but more than half of well-known colleges do accept super scores from college applications.
All right. And then we have a final thing here. What about AP scores? And we throw this in just because it's a standardized testing related topic that people often lean on us for advice on. So, very quickly, the primary function of AP scores has historically been college credit and placement, meaning you can actually get credit at your college. This is super valuable because otherwise you have to pay by the credit for the courses that you take in college. And it's also valuable because you can often kind of get into courses that you're genuinely interested in, courses in your major sooner by knocking out some general requirements with AP courses. We've seen AP scores gain importance in the admissions process. So historically, AP scores were not a big factor in college admissions, but with grade inflation, colleges are leaning on more kind of external validation of students' performance in school, and AP scores offer that. So they're a thing that can really help a student in the admissions process now, way more so than when I started doing this about 10 years ago. They are more important for admissions when you apply to a school that's test blind, even. So that might sound weird, but test blind UCLA does use AP scores in admissions, and so does UC Berkeley. So the two most competitive of the University of California schools, which are test blind, they do use these tests in admissions. So really, it's SAT, ACT blind, not test blind, but they
Yeah.
call it test blind. So that is what it is. Generally speaking, my advice is the tests are typically the first 2 full weeks in May. And you really want to determine how much work you need to do sooner rather than later. You've been in your AP courses now, if you're in them, for a few months. And so you think about how well you're doing in the course, especially how well you're doing on any assignments or tests that simulate the AP test. Document-based questions in AP social studies courses, multiple choice questions that are actually mimicking the format of the AP exam. Many teachers will include those on tests for an AP course. And you want to be ready on the test to essentially, do your very best, but you also have to be honest with yourself about how well you've been learning the material all semester. So if you have been struggling all along, then of course your AP prep period is going to have to be longer than a student who's done really well in the course all year. So you just have to be honest with yourself about how much work it's going to be. We get a lot of requests like the 2 weeks before AP exams for AP like crunch prep. And we can do that, but it's typically not very effective because the students who haven't thought about it until then are not the students who, have been totally on top of the coursework all year. So, our ideal would be starting AP prep in February or March for most students to aim for those May test dates. But it really depends on the student and the situation, and we can talk you through that if you're interested. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. At this point in the presentation, we're going to move on to the Q&A. So, Um, our first question is, will we receive a copy of the presentation slides? So we will post this presentation to YouTube. It'll be on YouTube sometime tomorrow. If you search Ivy Experience on YouTube, you'll find our YouTube channel where all of our webinars exist. And the best way to access this presentation would be from the link that'll be there. Second question. If your student is more into writing than science, would it look okay to opt out of the science but do the writing portion of the ACT? So the first thing I'll say about that is ACT writing is irrelevant to college admissions. ACT has a writing section because of certain statewide contracts that they have, where ACT is like the statewide testing for that school. So, whatever state you're from, you may have statewide standardized testing. That is part of a graduation requirement. Some states use the ACT for that. And when they do, they often use the writing portion of the ACT as a writing assessment. That is not something that any college uses for admissions. So there is no reason to take the ACT writing portion under any circumstances unless you're in one of those states where you need to take it to graduate high school. The ACT science section you can opt out of, but there are some schools that will require the science section. So when, Evan used a very careful phrase, required at registration. And it's required at optional at registration. Optional at registration because ACT doesn't really get to decide if the science section is optional. They're saying,
Yeah.
we're now giving you the option to take the ACT without the science section. Whether or not it's required is up to the college that you're applying to. So my advice is really to, take it if you're early on in this process so that you leave your options open. But if you're a senior retesting in the fall and you know your whole college list, at that point, look up the policies and see if it's actually necessary. But this far out, because ACT science being optional is so new, many colleges are, heavily preferring it, for students in STEM specifically, requiring it for all students, requiring it for students in STEM specifically. And so because these policies are so different, our advice right now is play it safe and take the science section. Science on the ACT is more of a what I call a mathy reading section. It's
Yep.
not really a test of science knowledge. It's they describe a science experiment and they give you a presentation of the data in some kind of visual form, like a chart, table, scatter plot. And then they ask students to draw conclusions from that data. So it's not, parts of a cell, balancing a chemical equation, drawing a force diagram. It's really more like science literacy in a way. All right, another question. Do colleges account for the nature of the courses a student took? That is to say, the rigor of a class and weigh grades accordingly? Or is an A in a higher rigor considered the same as an A in a lower rigor class? So colleges absolutely consider the rigor of courses and they judge your grades in context. Mechanically, it'll look different at different colleges. So there are some colleges where they take in the GPAs of the high schools and they have to kind of subjectively determine things between them. There are other colleges that will take your courses and they have their own weighting system. So, they might have a separate weighting system for AP or honors classes that's different from the way that your high school weights them for your GPA, and they're going to recalculate your GPA into their way of calculating a GPA. So it varies quite a bit just based on the individual college, but they all have a way to consider academic rigor and the level of the courses in addition to the grade. We have a joke here. It's not exactly a joke because it's a real question we get all the time. Is it better to get a B in an AP course or an A in, the standard level course or the high level course? And we asked a University of Pennsylvania admissions officer, and he said, well, if you want to go to Penn, you have to take the AP course and get an A. And that is the sad truth at the most selective schools in the country. There's no way to sugarcoat that. If that's what you're aiming for, you need to take the most challenging courses available and do really well in them because that's what everyone else who's applying there is going to do. On an individual level, when you're trying to judge the rigor of a course and kind of how much you should be pushing yourself, a way I like to think about it is if you choose to take a higher rigor course, whether that's AP, IB, honors, whatever it looks like for you, you know, if taking that course would make it your most challenging course, that's going to take up more of your time than any of your other courses, that's okay. It's okay to have one course that takes up more time than the others. However, if, your ability to do well in that course is predicated on doing so much extra work that you're losing sleep, that you're not having as much time to, participate in extracurricular activities that matter to you, that your grades are slipping in other courses because of all the time you're having to put into this one just to stay afloat, that's the point at which you probably need to kind of tone back the difficulty. Colleges want to see that you're challenging yourself and they want to see that you're doing well. And, the exact right answer for how to judge that calculus is highly subjective. But basically, you want to try to challenge yourself and thrive at the same time. That's kind of the broad way to put it. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you have any questions that are specific to your student, feel free to reach out to us. Our main company email, info@myivexperience.com. We're happy to talk to any of you about, potential testing plans or questions you have about the SAT or ACT. And we hope you have a great night. Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.